"Sir, this table is for wealthy customers only," the waitress said coldly. "But I just wanted to eat a sandwich to celebrate my—" "Move to the back table, now!" It was Frank's 76th birthday, and he had come to the nearest cafe hoping for a modest breakfast by the window. He didn't argue. He slowly pulled out his cane. With each step, the pain of shrapnel lodged in his knee reverberated through him. As he limped past the tables, the customers looked away in embarrassment. The old man sat heavily in a dark corner of the cafe. The waitress didn't apologize or even look back. But then the cafe owner noticed something on the old man's wrist and froze. As he got closer and saw what it was, his face went blank, and he was completely— The first rays of October sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of Frank Dennison's modest apartment, casting gentle shadows across the hardwood floor that had seen better decades. At 76, Frank had learned to appreciate these quiet morning moments when the world still slept, and his memories could wander freely through corridors of time that seemed both distant and immediate. The digital clock on his nightstand read 6:47 a.m., but sleep had abandoned him hours ago, as it often did when old wounds chose to remind him of their presence. Frank sat on the edge of his bed, his weathered hands resting on knees that had carried him through jungles and across battlefields, through decades of civilian life that sometimes felt more challenging than any military campaign. Today marked his 76th birthday, a milestone that would pass unmarked by celebration or fanfare. The silence in his apartment spoke volumes about the life he had built since Martha passed 5 years ago, leaving behind only photographs and memories that grew more precious with each passing day. The photograph on his nightstand captured Martha's radiant smile from their wedding day in 1972, when he had returned from overseas with stories he could never tell and dreams they would build together. Her eyes sparkled with the same warmth that had sustained him through 43 years of marriage, through nightmares that came without warning and celebrations that felt hollow without his fallen brothers beside him. Frank reached for the frame with fingers that trembled slightly, not from age but from the weight of remembrance. "Happy birthday to me," he whispered to her image, his voice carrying the gravelly texture of a man who had shouted orders across rice paddies and whispered prayers in foxholes. The ritual had become his morning anchor, a way to include Martha in the ceremonies of daily life that continued despite her absence. Frank rose slowly, his left knee protesting with the familiar sharp reminder of shrapnel that doctors had declared too dangerous to remove. The fragment had lodged there during his second tour, a souvenir from an evening when helicopter rotors failed and young men learned the true meaning of brotherhood. He reached for the wooden cane that had become his constant companion, its carved handle worn smooth by years of dependence and determination. The mirror in his bathroom reflected a man who had earned every line on his face, every silver strand in his carefully combed hair. Frank ran his fingers along his jaw, feeling the discipline of military grooming that had never left him. He selected his best flannel shirt from the closet, the blue one that Martha had always said brought out his eyes, and paired it with his cleanest jeans. Today deserved something special, even if he would be the only one to notice. As he buttoned his shirt, the faded tattoo on his left wrist caught the morning light. The emblem of the 1st Cavalry Division had once been sharp and dark, a symbol of pride and belonging that now appeared ghostly against his weathered skin. Frank paused, remembering the young soldier who had chosen that design in a Saigon parlor between missions, believing it would mark him forever as part of something greater than himself. Time had proven him right, though not in ways he could have imagined. The decision to venture out for breakfast had come to him gradually, born from a desire to mark his birthday with something more substantial than instant coffee and yesterday's bread. Romano's Café had caught his attention during his weekly walks through downtown, its warm windows and handwritten menu suggesting the kind of family establishment where a man might enjoy a peaceful meal and watch the world wake up. Frank had never been inside, but today felt like the right time for small adventures. The October air carried the crisp promise of autumn as Frank made his way down the sidewalk, his cane tapping a steady rhythm against the concrete. Each step required consideration, a careful negotiation between momentum and balance that had become second nature over the years. Other pedestrians moved past him with the urgency of people who had forgotten how to notice the changing seasons or appreciate the simple act of moving forward under one's own power. Romano's Café occupied the corner of Main and Elm, its brick facade weathered but welcoming, with large windows that offered glimpses of warm light and the promise of human connection. Frank paused outside, adjusting his jacket and gathering the courage that had once carried him into hostile territory, but now seemed necessary for simple social interactions. Through the glass, he could see families sharing breakfast, business people reviewing documents over coffee, and elderly couples reading newspapers in comfortable silence. The bell above the door announced his arrival with a cheerful chime that seemed to pause conversations momentarily before normal rhythms resumed. Frank took a moment to orient himself, noting the location of restrooms and exits with the automatic assessment that military training had embedded in his consciousness. The cafe buzzed with the pleasant energy of morning routines, voices blending with the hiss of the espresso machine and the gentle clatter of dishes being cleared and reset. A table by the window caught Frank's attention immediately. It offered a perfect view of the small park across the street, where children played on swings and elderly men fed pigeons from wooden benches. The morning light streamed through the glass, creating a warm pool of illumination that seemed to invite contemplation and quiet celebration. Frank approached the table slowly, his cane helping him navigate between chairs and the scattered belongings of other diners. He lowered himself into the seat with careful deliberation, his knee sending sharp protests that he acknowledged with practiced stoicism. The view from the window exceeded his expectations, offering a panorama of ordinary life that felt both comforting and bittersweet. Frank removed his worn leather wallet from his jacket pocket, counting the modest collection of bills inside with the precision of someone who understood the value of every dollar. The cafe's atmosphere embraced him gradually, the warmth and energy of human connection that he had almost forgotten existed outside his solitary routines. At nearby tables, conversations flowed between generations, friends shared gossip over steaming cups, and servers moved with practiced efficiency between kitchen and dining room. Frank allowed himself to imagine being part of this community, a regular customer whose order would be remembered and whose presence would be anticipated. A young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and immaculate makeup approached his table, her smile bright but somehow calculating. Jessica wore her server's apron like a costume, her designer shoes and expensive jewelry suggesting aspirations that extended far beyond her current position. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed appearance determined worth, and her eyes quickly assessed Frank's modest clothing and humble demeanor. "Sir, this table is for wealthy customers only," the waitress said coldly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had made similar judgments countless times before. Frank looked up at her with genuine confusion, his weathered hands still folded around his wallet. The statement struck him as odd, given the cafe's welcoming appearance and family-friendly atmosphere. He had assumed that any paying customer would be welcome at any available table, but perhaps he had misunderstood the establishment's policies. "But I just wanted to eat a sandwich to celebrate my—" Frank began, his voice carrying the gentle tone of someone explaining rather than arguing. "Move to the back table. Now," Jessica interrupted, her patience evaporating with the efficiency of someone who viewed poor customers as obstacles to profitable service. The harshness of her command cut through the cafe's pleasant atmosphere like a blade, drawing subtle glances from nearby diners who pretended not to notice while clearly registering the interaction. Frank felt the familiar heat of shame rising in his chest, the old soldier's instinct to maintain dignity in the face of unjust treatment, warring with the civilian's desire to simply disappear from uncomfortable situations. It was Frank's 76th birthday, and he had come to the nearest cafe hoping for a modest breakfast by the window, a small celebration of another year survived and another milestone reached. The simple pleasure of watching the world wake up while enjoying coffee and conversation seemed like a reasonable birthday wish, but apparently even modest dreams could be crushed by arbitrary rules and cold hearts. He didn't argue. He slowly pulled out his cane, the carved handle feeling heavier than usual as he prepared to surrender his small claim to dignity and comfort. The physical act of rising from the chair required more effort than he cared to admit, his joints protesting the sudden movement and his pride bleeding with each labored motion. With each step, the pain of shrapnel lodged in his knee reverberated through him, a reminder of sacrifices made in distant jungles for people who would never know his name or understand the price of their freedom. The irony was not lost on him that he had endured enemy fire to protect the very liberties that now seemed to exclude him from a simple table by a window. As he limped past the tables, the customers looked away in embarrassment, their discomfort obvious but their intervention absent. Some buried their faces in newspapers. Others suddenly became fascinated with their phones, and a few whispered among themselves about the awkward scene unfolding before them. Frank understood their reluctance to become involved, but their silence felt like another small defeat in a day that had promised simple celebration. The old man sat heavily in a dark corner of the cafe, the shadows seeming to embrace him with the familiarity of old companions. The table wobbled slightly under the weight of his arms, and the view consisted of nothing more interesting than the cafe's rear wall and the occasional glimpse of the kitchen's swinging doors. Frank arranged himself as comfortably as possible, his cane propped against the wall within easy reach, and his wallet returned to his pocket with hands that shook slightly from more than age. The waitress didn't apologize or even look back, her attention already focused on more promising customers whose appearance suggested better tips and easier service. Jessica moved between tables with renewed energy, her laughter and charm reserved for diners whose clothing and accessories met her standards for worthwhile attention. Frank sat in his assigned exile, watching the life of the cafe continue around him as if he had become invisible. Just another piece of furniture to be ignored until closing time. The birthday breakfast he had imagined seemed like a foolish dream now. The window table with its warming sunlight, a luxury reserved for people whose worth could be measured in the cut of their clothes and the balance in their bank accounts. But then the cafe owner noticed something on the old man's wrist and froze. As he got closer and saw what it was, his face went blank, and he was completely... Shadows of recognition. Michael Romano had been wiping down the espresso machine when the scene unfolded, his attention divided between maintaining his equipment and monitoring the morning rush that kept his family cafe profitable. At 45, he had inherited more than just a business from his father. He had inherited a deep respect for service and sacrifice that shaped how he viewed both customers and community. The harsh exchange between his waitress and the elderly gentleman had caught his peripheral attention, but it was what he glimpsed on the old man's wrist that stopped him cold. From his position behind the counter, Michael watched as Frank adjusted his sleeve, the simple motion revealing a faded tattoo that seemed to reach across decades and strike Michael's consciousness like lightning. The emblem was barely visible, worn by time and weathered by age, but the distinctive shape of the 1st Cavalry Division insignia was unmistakable to someone who had grown up studying every detail of his father's military photographs. Michael set down his cleaning cloth with hands that had begun to tremble slightly, his eyes never leaving the old man who sat with such quiet dignity despite the humiliation he had just endured. The resemblance to stories told and retold throughout his childhood was too striking to ignore, too specific to dismiss as coincidence. This could not possibly be the same man, could it? The sergeant his father had described with reverence and gratitude for over 3 decades? The memory crashed over Michael with the force of a tidal wave, transporting him instantly to a different time and place. He was 10 years old again, sitting cross-legged on the living room carpet while his father, Michael Romano Sr., carefully cleaned his service medals at the kitchen table. The ritual happened every Veterans Day, a sacred ceremony that transformed their modest home into a shrine of remembrance and respect. "Tell me about the helicopter again, Papa," young Michael had requested, his voice filled with the eager anticipation of a child who never tired of hearing about real heroes and genuine courage. His father had paused in his polishing, his weathered hands holding a purple heart that gleamed under the overhead light. The expression that crossed his face was complex, mixing pride with sorrow, gratitude with loss. "It was April 1969, son. We were coming back from a reconnaissance mission near Quezon when Charlie got lucky with a rocket-propelled grenade." The story that followed had been etched into Michael's memory with the precision of a military briefing. The UH-1 Huey had been approaching the landing zone when enemy fire erupted from the tree line, sending shrapnel through the aircraft's hull and setting the fuel system ablaze. His father, then a young private named Mickey Romano, had taken multiple fragments in his legs and back, leaving him unable to move as flames began consuming the helicopter's interior. "I thought that was the end, Michael," his father had continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of genuine terror recalled. The smoke was getting thicker, the heat was getting closer, and I could hear ammunition starting to cook off in the storage compartments. I was making peace with God when this sergeant came back for me. The sergeant's name had been Frank Dennison, and according to Michael's father, he had already helped evacuate 3 other wounded soldiers when he noticed that Mickey Romano was still trapped in the burning aircraft. Despite his own injuries, including shrapnel in his left knee that would plague him for the rest of his life, Sergeant Dennison had crawled back into the inferno to reach the young private who was certain he would die alone and forgotten. "He dragged me 200 meters through mud and gunfire," Michael's father had recounted, his eyes distant with the memory of salvation delivered by human courage. Never said a word about his own pain, never complained about the weight, never suggested leaving me behind, just kept pulling and pulling until we reached the medical evacuation point. The detail that had always fascinated young Michael was the description of the sergeant's tattoo, visible as he strained to carry his wounded comrade to safety. "He had this tattoo on his left wrist," his father had explained, tracing the shape in the air with his finger. "The emblem of our division, the 1st Cavalry. It was fresh then, probably got it during his first leave in Saigon. But I remember thinking that if I survived, I would never forget that tattoo or the man who wore it." Michael Sr. had survived, obviously, returning home to build a life that included marriage, children, and eventually the cafe that would become his son's inheritance. But he had never forgotten his debt to Sergeant Frank Dennison, and he had never stopped hoping for an opportunity to express his gratitude properly. That opportunity had never come. Despite years of writing letters to veterans organizations and searching through military databases that seemed designed to protect privacy rather than facilitate reunion. "If you ever meet that man," his father had said during one of their last conversations before cancer claimed him 3 years ago, "you make sure he knows that Mickey Romano never forgot what he did. You make sure he understands that every day I lived after that was a gift he gave me." Now, staring across his cafe at the elderly man who bore such a striking resemblance to his father's descriptions, Michael felt the full weight of those final instructions. The limp, the age, the quiet dignity under pressure, and most importantly, that faded tattoo that spoke of service and sacrifice in distant jungles where young men learned the true meaning of brotherhood. Michael moved from behind the counter slowly, his approach casual enough to avoid drawing attention, but purposeful enough to bring him closer to the truth. He pretended to bust nearby tables, collecting abandoned coffee cups and wiping down surfaces, while positioning himself for a better view of the old man's wrist. Each step brought more confirmation of what his heart already knew, but his mind struggled to accept. Frank sat in his assigned corner with the patience of someone who had learned to wait, his hands folded on the table in a manner that spoke of military discipline maintained through decades of civilian life. When he reached for his water glass, the motion caused his sleeve to slide back slightly, revealing more of the tattoo that had become Michael's focal point. The emblem was exactly as his father had described it, positioned precisely where memory had placed it, faded by time, but unmistakable in its significance. Other customers had begun to notice the tension in the cafe, the way conversations had become more subdued, and glances more frequent in the direction of the corner table. An elderly woman at a nearby booth leaned toward her companion and whispered something that caused them both to look at Frank with expressions of sympathetic disapproval for his treatment. A businessman checking his phone periodically glanced up to observe the situation, his face reflecting the uncomfortable awareness that something unjust had occurred in his presence. Jessica continued her service with the determined cheerfulness of someone who refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing, her attention focused exclusively on customers whose appearance promised profitable interaction. She refilled coffee cups with extra enthusiasm, laughed a bit too loudly at mediocre jokes, and generally performed the role of the perfect server for everyone except the man she had relegated to social exile. Michael found himself studying Frank's posture, noting the subtle signs of military bearing that civilian life had never completely erased. The way he sat with his back straight despite his obvious fatigue, the manner in which his eyes periodically scanned the room with practiced awareness, the careful placement of his cane within easy reach but positioned to avoid blocking foot traffic. These were not the habits of an ordinary retiree, but the reflexes of someone trained to assess situations and respond to threats. The conviction grew stronger with each observation, each small detail that aligned with stories told and retold throughout his childhood. This was not merely a resemblance or a coincidence of shared military service. This was the man who had saved his father's life, who had risked everything to ensure that a young private named Mickey Romano would return home to build a family and establish the very cafe where he now sat, unrecognized and unwelcome. Michael's hands clenched into fists as the full irony of the situation became clear. The man who had guaranteed his existence, who had made possible every success and happiness his family had experienced, was being treated like an unwanted burden in the establishment that existed because of his courage and sacrifice. The injustice was so profound that it seemed to demand immediate correction, regardless of potential embarrassment or awkward explanations. But before taking action, Michael needed absolute certainty. He needed to hear the man speak, to confirm what his eyes and instincts were telling him. He needed to bridge the gap between childhood stories and present reality, between gratitude inherited and recognition earned. The moment had come to honor his father's final request and acknowledge a debt that could never truly be repaid, but must nonetheless be attempted. Michael straightened his shoulders and began walking toward the corner table, his heart pounding with the anticipation of a reunion that was 40 years in the making. Each step brought him closer to the moment when silence would be broken and recognition would transform a simple cafe into a place where honor would finally be served alongside the morning coffee. The salute of recognition. Michael Romano approached the corner table with steps that carried the weight of 4 decades of gratitude and anticipation. His heart hammered against his ribs as he drew closer to the man who had unknowingly shaped the course of his entire family's existence. The conversations around him seemed to fade into background noise, replaced by the thundering awareness that he was about to bridge a gap between past heroism and present recognition that had waited far too long to be closed. Frank looked up as the cafe owner approached, his weathered features showing polite curiosity mixed with the wariness of someone who had already endured one unpleasant interaction this morning. His hands remained folded on the table, steady despite the tremor that occasionally reminded him of his age, and his posture maintained the dignity that no amount of mistreatment could diminish. "Excuse me, sir," Michael began, his voice carrying a tremor of emotion that he struggled to control. "I hope you don't mind the interruption, but I couldn't help noticing." He paused, gesturing gently toward Frank's wrist where the faded tattoo remained partially visible beneath his sleeve. "Are you by any chance Sergeant Frank Dennison, 1st Cavalry Division?" The question hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning decades of separation and silence. Frank's eyes widened with surprise, then narrowed slightly with the caution of a man who had learned that recognition sometimes brought complications rather than comfort. He studied Michael's face carefully, searching for clues about the motivation behind such a specific inquiry from a complete stranger. "Yes, I am," Frank replied slowly, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone who had learned to be careful about revealing too much too quickly. "Though I haven't been called sergeant in quite some time, may I ask how you know that name?" Michael felt his throat tighten with the magnitude of the moment. The confirmation he had hoped for now demanded action, and the words his father had made him promise to speak suddenly seemed inadequate for the emotion they needed to carry. He pulled out his wallet with hands that shook slightly, retrieving a photograph that had been carefully preserved behind plastic for over 3 decades. "My father was Private Michael Romano," he said, extending the faded military portrait toward Frank. "Mickey Romano from Brooklyn, April 1969 near Quezon. You pulled him out of a burning helicopter after it was hit by enemy fire." Frank accepted the photograph with reverence, his eyes scanning the young face that smiled back at him from across the years. Recognition dawned gradually, like sunrise breaking through persistent clouds, and his expression shifted from confusion to wonder to something approaching joy. The memories that flooded back were both painful and precious, filled with the sounds of rotor blades and distant gunfire, the smell of aviation fuel and burning metal, the weight of wounded men who trusted him to carry them to safety. Mickey Romano, Frank whispered, his voice thick with emotion. How is he? Did he make it home all right? Did his wounds heal properly? The questions tumbled out with the urgency of someone who had carried concern for decades without opportunity for resolution. Michael's eyes filled with tears that he no longer attempted to hide. He made it home, Sergeant. He lived a full life because of what you did. He married my mother, raised 3 children, and built this cafe from nothing. He talked about you every Veterans Day, told us stories about your courage and sacrifice. He passed away 3 years ago, but not before making me promise that if I ever found you, I would thank you properly. The emotional weight of the revelation seemed to settle over both men like a heavy blanket, wrapping them in shared understanding of loss, survival, and the bonds that connect strangers across impossible distances. Frank handed back the photograph with hands that trembled slightly, his eyes bright with unshed tears that spoke of memories both cherished and painful. I never knew what happened to him after the medical evacuation, Frank admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. There were so many wounded that day, so much chaos. I always wondered if my efforts made any difference, if anyone actually made it home because of what we did out there. Michael stood straighter, his voice carrying across the cafe with increasing volume as emotion overrode his natural reserve. Ladies and gentlemen, he called out, causing conversations to halt and heads to turn throughout the dining room. I need to share something important with all of you. The cafe fell silent except for the gentle hiss of the espresso machine and the distant sounds of traffic from the street outside. Customers set down their coffee cups and newspapers, turning their attention toward the corner table where an extraordinary revelation was about to unfold. Even Jessica paused in her serving, her expression shifting from annoyance to curiosity as she recognized that something significant was happening. This man, Michael continued, gesturing toward Frank with unmistakable pride and reverence, is Sergeant Frank Dennison, a hero of the Vietnam War. In April 1969, he risked his own life to save my father and several other wounded soldiers from a burning helicopter under enemy fire. Without his courage and sacrifice, I wouldn't be standing here today, and this cafe wouldn't exist. The silence that followed was profound, filled with the weight of recognition and the collective understanding that they were in the presence of someone whose actions had created ripples, extending far beyond the moment of their occurrence. Slowly, understanding spread through the room like dawn breaking over still water, transforming casual observers into witnesses to something remarkable and humbling. Today is his 76th birthday, Michael announced, his voice growing stronger with each word. He came here hoping for a simple breakfast by the window, a modest celebration of another year of life earned through service and sacrifice. Instead, he was treated with disrespect and forced to sit in this corner like he didn't matter. Frank attempted to rise, clearly uncomfortable with the attention and publicity, but Michael gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Please, Sergeant, let me finish what my father started. Let me give him the thanks he never had the chance to deliver personally. Jessica's face had gone pale, the reality of her actions becoming clear as she understood the magnitude of her mistake. The wealthy customers she had prioritized seemed suddenly insignificant compared to the genuine hero she had dismissed and humiliated. Her hands shook as she realized that her shallow judgments had led her to treat a man of extraordinary character with contempt and disrespect. Michael stepped back, came to attention with military precision that would have made his father proud, and rendered a crisp salute that cut through the cafe's atmosphere like a blade of honor and recognition. Sergeant Frank Dennison, he said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room, on behalf of my father, Private Michael Romano, and everyone whose lives you touched through your service, I salute you and thank you for your sacrifice. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every person in the cafe rose to their feet as if responding to a single command, their chairs scraping against the floor in a symphony of respect and recognition. An elderly man near the window, tears streaming down his face, brought his hand to his forehead in a trembling salute. A young mother lifted her small daughter so she could see the hero everyone was honoring. Business people in expensive suits stood with the same reverence as blue-collar workers, united in their recognition of genuine greatness. The applause that followed was not the polite acknowledgement of entertainment, but the thunderous appreciation of people who understood they were witnessing something rare and precious. Frank sat overwhelmed, his own tears flowing freely as he experienced the recognition and gratitude that had eluded him for decades. The birthday celebration he had imagined paled in comparison to this unexpected gift of acknowledgement and respect. Jessica approached the table slowly, her earlier arrogance replaced by genuine shame and remorse. "Sergeant Dennison," she said, her voice barely audible above the continuing applause, "I owe you an apology that words cannot adequately express. I judged you by your appearance and treated you with disrespect that you never deserved. I am deeply sorry, and I hope you can forgive my ignorance." Frank looked up at her with eyes that held no anger, only the weary wisdom of someone who had learned that forgiveness served the forgiver as much as the forgiven. "We all make mistakes, young lady," he said gently. "The important thing is that we learn from them and treat others better in the future." Michael personally escorted Frank to the window table he had originally chosen, the morning sunlight streaming across the surface like a spotlight designed to illuminate heroes who had waited too long for recognition. The breakfast that followed was magnificent, prepared with extra care by a kitchen staff who understood they were serving someone special, someone whose story would be retold long after the last dish was washed and the last customer had departed. As Frank enjoyed his birthday meal in the place of honor he had always deserved, Michael made several quiet decisions that would outlast the morning's emotions. The window table would be permanently reserved for veterans, marked with a small plaque that honored all who had served. The menu would feature Sergeant Frank's Special, a sandwich that would remind future customers of the heroes who might be sitting among them unrecognized. Most importantly, staff training would include lessons about treating every customer with dignity and respect, regardless of appearance or perceived status. Years later, long after Frank had peacefully passed away in his sleep, Romano's Café remained a sanctuary for veterans and a reminder that true heroes often walk among us unnoticed and unacknowledged. The photograph of Frank and Michael's father occupied a place of honor near the window table, and regular customers would point it out to newcomers, sharing the story of recognition delayed but ultimately delivered. The legacy of that morning extended far beyond a single act of belated gratitude. It served as a reminder that every person carries a story of struggle and triumph, that appearances can deceive, and that the greatest service we can provide is the simple act of treating each other with the dignity and respect that every human being deserves. In a world that often overlooks its heroes, Romano's Café became a place where service was remembered, sacrifice was honored, and recognition was never again denied to those who had earned it through courage and selfless action.